Welcome to this edition of the YAHOWAH blog here from our Rainbow Studio. I am your host, Craig Winn. We're continuing our presentation of the gateway back to the Holocaust, because the imposition of a Palestinian state, which is really nothing but an ethnic slur calling for genocide of Jews, is suicidal for Israel. It will open the gates to a slaughter of Jews far worse than what the world saw in the early 1940s throughout Europe. And because this eventuality seems inevitable, and since it was predicted by the prophets, we're reviewing what Isaiah had to say. And in Isaiah 17, the prophet is quite clear that the troubles are going to escalate with the fall of Damascus, with buildings being turned into rubble. And of last count, there were 106,000 buildings in and around Damascus and in this portion of Syria that have been destroyed. They're a twisted heap of rubble, such that the prophecy is fulfilled. That this would be perpetrated by Islamic jihadists, which has also been fulfilled. It says by terrorists, but by implication, that is an Islamic jihadist. The prophet indicated that these terrorists would be associated with those who refer to themselves as refugees in Jordan. Boy, has that ever been fulfilled. And we learn that as a result of the fall of the government out of Syria, which clearly has also happened, prophecy fulfilled, that the world would propose and impose, forcing Israel to sacrifice its heart for the pretense of peace, thinning the nation at the waist and making Israel indefensible, which is why I call it the gateway to the Holocaust. This is not a two-state solution. This is the dissolution of the state of Israel. And we find that we're on the cusp of meetings next week where the UN is meeting to announce the creation of a Palestinian state. And we have France, Great Britain, Germany, all concurring that needs to happen. And we just had Spain have the Inquisition Part 2, where 21 nations agreed that there needed to be a Palestinian state to reward the murderous Muslims who perpetrated 10/7, of course. It is one of the most disgusting ideas in human history and among the most ignorant. I've shared numerous occasions that Palestine is not just a myth. It is an ugly blood libel. It is an ethnic slur. It is an outright lie. It was created by Emperor Hadrian when he was in the midst of slaughtering Jews and trying to remove Judea from the face of the earth. And the Romans were bastards. That probably no civilization in human history more egregious than Rome. It's why Dode in his prophecy through Daniel was quite clear in calling Rome and then the church that would evolve out of Rome the ultimate beast that is vicious and then treads upon the whole world. While attacking Judea for the third time since 66 BCE, this occasion 133 CE, the emperor tortured literate Jews so that he could root out from them the name of a former enemy that was just vile. And the most vile enemy that the early Israelites faced were the Philistines. So Hadrian decided, well, I'm going to call the place Philistina, just to irritate the Jews that I'm torturing and murdering and enslaving en masse. That's how it came to be. 133 CE as an ethnic slur by the Roman Emperor Hadrian while he was perpetrating mass torture on Jews. The British, who have been revolting anti-Semites for a very long time, loved Hadrian's remark. They loved the slur on Israel. And so they picked it up and applied it when, at the end of World War I, and the Ottomans had lost, mostly because the Brits bribed Muslim warlords to fight the Ottoman Empire, promising that if they prevailed, that the British Empire would carve out little fiefdoms for all of them. It's how Arabia became Saudi Arabia. It's how almost all of the areas of the Middle East got carved out. And in that process, because of the fact that Chaim Weizmann had perfected smokeless gunpowder, I think a number of other inventions on behalf of the British Empire that helped considerably in the winning of the Second or the First World War. They were given Israel back, and the all the other countries in the Middle East got fiefdoms for tribal heads carved out for them. It's called the Balfour Declaration, which would have been most of today, well, all of today's Israel and much of Jordan given to Israel, while it would only been a tiny fraction of the Middle East. So from a land point of view, it was the worst land, and with very few people, and with the richest land being given to the Muslims. Well, they reneged, as Brits are wont to do, but the name that the Brits applied to it was the old Roman slur. And so it hung around, and it was all but forgotten once the state of Israel was created in 1948. And as it would turn out, with Russian arms, the collective strength of all Islamic nations around Israel failed in 1948 to destroy the nation of Israel. By attacking Israel in 1948, of course, they completely nullified any agreement that the UN had made restricting Israel. You know, if you say that I propose an agreement that you get this part, you get this part, and you divide things this way, and those people that don't like the agreement, in this case the Muslims, try to obliterate you, then they can't go back and say, okay, I know we lost the war, but now we want those old terms back. Yeah, doesn't work that way unless you're insane, which, well, Marxists today and Muslims seem to be. The Muslims lost again in 1967 with the Six-Day War, which was, again, all Muslims against Jews. And although the Jews were outnumbered 100-1 and outgunned by a similar margin, the Jews won again. So the Muslims and the Marxists that were supplying their weapons decided for a different ploy, and this different ploy was, let's dust off the old moniker that Hadrian had used, and we'll call the Muslims living in and around Israel Palestinians. And the entire purpose was singular: to annihilate Israel, to exterminate all Jews. That was the only purpose of it, to do so through terrorism, through the PLO. But what's sad is that over time, Jews themselves began to use that name. The media still use the name. Politicians use the name. I've been telling Jews for the last 20 years that by continuing to use this racial slur, that they are guaranteed to suffer the consequence, which is the imposition of a state under the name of that slur. And you just can't get Jews to listen. I gave them every reason. I have done everything I can to convince Jews you can never use that name. It is an ethnic slur against you. But, you know, Jews are a special kind of crazy because, well, look at the symbol of Israel, that blue star, which they call the Star of David. It's not the Star of David. It's the Star of Bar Kokhba. And it's the very symbol that Jews were harassed under and slaughtered under, had genocide perpetrated against them when they were forced to wear that symbol. And yet that is the symbol that they parade around under. And it's just, God, how can you be that suicidal? That's self-harming. You know, clearly, using Palestinian is self-harming. And now, Israel, you're going to catch the blunt of it. And I've also told Jews that if you don't recognize that your enemy is Islam and that Hamas is just a symbol, as is Hezbollah, as is the PLO, as is Fatah, as is the Mother Brotherhood, as are Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Iran and Saudi Arabia et al., that they're just symptoms of a root cause, Islam, that has been at war with you for all of its 1,400 years, perpetrate genocide against you in Arabia. If you can't recognize that, and that those two ugly scars on the Temple Mount are nothing but trophies to the subjugation of Jews, and you don't even have the courage to remove them, and you don't have the wherewithal to say, our enemy is Islam, therefore we cannot bomb Hamas out of existence. I mean, it's that simple. Every Gazan is a Muslim. Hamas is Islamic. It doesn't matter how many of you kill, there's always more of them. You can't win this war that way. And by continuing to fight this war this way, exactly what I said was going to happen. You not only make more jihadists worldwide, where there's probably 20, 30, 40, 50 times more than you actually killed, now wanting to kill you, but you turn the whole world against you. Now, you might say, oh, the whole world was against us. All we did is bring out to the surface the real anti-Semitism of the world. That may well be true, but it doesn't change the fact that you lost the war of public opinion, and that you made a bad situation worse by going into Gaza, and there was never any chance of success. When you start a war and you define victory as something that is wholly and completely impossible to achieve, you cannot win. And the obliteration, the de-arming, the depowering, the elimination of Hamas in Gaza was never possible. You can't kill your way or bomb your way to victory in this regard. I don't care how many of them you kill. You claim you've killed 15 to 20,000 of them, and there are 60,000 replacing them. You can kill another 60,000 of them, and there'll be 200,000 replacing them. All the while, you turn the world against you. So that's where we find ourselves, and as a result, the world is meeting next week to award a Fakistinian state. Ignorant because, well, world leaders are largely Marxists at this point. We have two generations of young people, virtually everybody under 30 is so indoctrinated, they've lost their conscience. They are siding with Muslims. They have no clue about their history, the nature of the religion. They just want to lash out at Jews for all sorts of stupid reasons. But the fact is, that is the majority now of voters worldwide. And this is what they're calling for. And heretofore, Israel had an ally, even with America being unwilling to allow Israel to win any war, and ultimately putting Israel in jeopardy by the way it throttled Israel's defense and the way that it armed Israel's opponents. The United States would always veto such aggressive actions in the United Nations. But there's something that's changed. You have a crazy man in the White House now. And unfortunately, it's a crazy man that Israel trusts, which makes him the most damaging of all, because he's your next new Neville Chamberlain. And this crazy man in the White House, he has been bribed to the tune of $16.5 billion. Publicly announced deals between Qatar, which is the International Bank of Islamic Terrorism, Saudi Arabia, which is the birthplace of Islamic terrorism, and the United Arab Emirates. Between those three countries, Trump and company has received $16.5 billion. He's owned and operated by those countries. Now, there's a little more to it than that. It isn't strictly the result of bribes, although $16.5 billion even buys a president of the United States. Used to only cost about $20 million. That was the price of Obama, but he was an easy patsy. And George Bush, he also was bribed by $20 million. That used to be enough to get it done, but this time it's $16.5 billion. Now, as I say, there is a little more to the story, and that it's become evident, and I did a whole series on this about 3 months ago, because it became obvious to me what was happening. The United States has really screwed up its international trade policy, such that America is no longer trusted. And with the Trump tariffs, it became even worse. And with the ongoing sanctions against Russia, made it worse. And as a result of all of its machinations, on and off, for example, on using Ukraine as a proxy to go kill Russians, Europeans, Australians, the Japanese, for example, have all decided that the United States is not a viable and reliable trade partner. And therefore, what's happened is that even with the International Monetary Fund, there is now considerable movement on making the euro the international reserve currency. And what that means is that Donald Trump knows that what he has done recently puts the dollar at risk of losing its reserve currency status. And that may not mean a lot to many of you, but the US dollar is a fiat currency, which means that rather than being based on assets like gold, like it used to be, it doesn't have any backing anymore. In fact, it's actually a debt instrument. It's the opposite of an asset. Look on it. It's a Federal Reserve note. It's a debt instrument. And it is created, there's an illusion, literally a religious faith in the value of it. And America's deficits became so enormous, larger than the rest of the world's combined, at $40 trillion. Much, much, much greater than our total GDP. That the only way to create the illusion of solvency and to finance that debt was to create the illusion of money, because there was almost no one that wanted to buy T-bills. T-bills was financing just this tiny, tiny bit of the debt. If you actually tried to finance the entire debt from T-bills, the interest rates would be 15% or more, and the U.S. deficit would be growing at $6 trillion a year faster than it is now. So this thing called quantitative easing, which because of the reserve currency status and international trade, and everybody has to have enormous amounts of dollars to do that, the currency can be devalued through the illusion of money, and that illusion of money is what is being used to create the illusion of solvency for the United States. You lose the reserve currency status, it's over. Now, the only thing then that is left is the petrodollar, which is now the primary underpinning of it. And so that's why Donald Trump plays into the hands of the Saudi Arabians, because they are the dominant player in maintaining petrodollars. And even though they are selling oil now under many different currencies and have flirted with BRICS, Saudi Arabia and Mikey, MBS, Mikey to my wife, she knew him personally back in the day when he was a young man and was bragging about having how many of his nannies and maids that he had tortured to death and killed when he was a young boy. He is a psychopath, a very sadistic psychopath. He is a bright psychopath, and he has leveraged the petrodollar into a deal with Trump whereby the United States has pledged to defend Saudi Arabia against any foe, including Israel, with its own sons and daughters, with its own troops, shedding its own blood for Saudi Arabia, which it would never do for, well, almost anyone else, including Israel. Number two, giving Saudi Arabia nuclear technology. And you say, oh, well, it's civilian use. That's the same thing the Iranians said, isn't it? And when the Iranians said it, I said, how could you be that stupid? All atoms do in a nuclear plant is they boil water. A country that sits on an ocean of gas and oil does not need atoms to boil water. It tries to get rid of the natural gas because it's harder to sell by just burning it in the atmosphere. No nation that sits on an ocean of oil and gas needs atoms to boil water. Nuclear technology. Number three, because Muslims have an average IQ that is right there at retard. It's a mid to low 70s. What they need is artificial intelligence, and Trump is supplying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of chip manufacturing and artificial intelligence capability. And on top of that, $150 billion worth of weapons. So he's caved in to essentially giving Israel's enemies the very things that they craved, but what they want in return is Israel served up on a silver platter. And you might say, wait a minute, they just want a state for the Palestinians. Oh, poor Palestinians, they deserve a state. Well, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. They aren't poor. They're murderous. They're disgusting. Absolutely, utterly revolting. They perpetrated the most savage crime of the millennia. No one has ever been as savage as they were. The Nazis were idyllic compared to the invading Muslims of 10/7. No one has ever been that disgusting. And they did it while screaming Allahu Akbar, which means they didn't do it as Hamas. They did it as Gazan Muslims, period. And nonetheless, what the world finds itself in is a total capitulation to them. And when they're given a state carved out of the heart of Israel, it isn't for the purpose of them having a homeland and living in peace and prosperity and freedom, besides the Jews who will be protected and live in peace and a harmony, because all it means is that the IDF will no longer have the ability to control arms shipments there, and there will be hundreds of thousands of Islamic jihadists that will flood not only into Israel from outside of Israel, but from inside of Israel, armed to the teeth as a result of the creation of that state. That is what the Saudi Arabians know. That's what the Qataris know. That is the reason that the Muslims in Gaza perpetrated 10/7. They knew this is what it would lead to. They knew what Israel would do in response. They knew that they could control Israel through the hostages. They have played Israel for a fool, and this is what is being delivered. And what's going to happen as a result of all of that is that the next 10/7, and it is assured, it's not only going to happen with Muslims coming in from Syria and from Lebanon and from Jordan and from Saudi Arabia and from Egypt and down also through Syria, which it now controls, from Turkey. But for the most part, those Muslims are going to replicate what they did on 10/7, and they're going to be joined by hundreds of thousands of Islamic jihadists from inside Israel, from this newly afforded Islamic state of terror known as the state of racial slur called Palestine. And they're going to come in on foot and on motorbikes. They're going to come in with rifles and RPGs and with knives and garden utensils. That's what's going to happen. Just as they did on 10/7. And the fact is, the IDF is wholly and completely ill-prepared to stop a flood of Muslims. That's why it was called Al-Aqsa flood. That's why the prophet Yeshayah speaks of a flood of Muslims too numerous to count. More than there are bullets in all of the IDF possession. All flooding into Israel, and it's going to come from the inside out, not just from the outside in, as a result of this state of Fakistan. That's the purpose of it. So what I want is I want you to know what is coming. So as I was sharing through Yeshayah, in addition to predicting that all of this was going to happen and that the heart of Israel would be carved out, that Israel would be narrowed at its waist and become indefensible because of the machinations of world politicians, he said it was going to happen before the Shabuah harvest. And the Shabuah harvest, it's called Shabuah Sevens. It happens 7 years before year 6000 Yah, when the Messiah died and Yahweh returned to their people on the day of reconciliations. And so the Shabuah harvest, 7 years before 2033, which is year 6000 Yah, is 22 May, a Shabat in 2026. 12 months from now. Which is why I have been warning all who will listen that an imposed state of Fakistan is going to be shoved down Israel's throat prior to that time. And therefore, the United States is not going to veto this bill. Now, could it veto the one that's coming up here between June 2nd and June 4th? Sure, because we have a year. Will they? I'm not so sure. Maybe, maybe not. But I know what Trump is trying to do. What Trump is trying to do is appease Israel by saying, I got your hostages back. We ended this war. Aren't I great? Now let's solve it let's do the ultimate deal and give these poor Palestinians a state, and we'll promise to protect Israel. And they'll believe him, and they'll accept it. And 2/3 of Jews will commit suicide. That's what the prophets are telling us. So when we move through the timing of it, the next thing that goes on is presented in the 18th chapter of Yeshayah. It's a continued story. And the prophet uses somewhere between, initially there's 50. I don't know what the total is. We'll find out because we're going to go through the material. I've forgotten the exact number, but initially there's 50. Very specific attributes that Yeshayah uses to describe the nation most responsible for betraying Israel and making it indefensible, that begins a world war and leads to the beginning of the time of Israel's troubles. And what the prophets say is the death of 2 out of every 3 Jews, and a more horrific experience than at any time in world history. And so Yahowah is none too pleased with the nation that he views as most responsible for this. And since he has seen the future in our past and reported to us 2,700 years ago exactly what was going to happen, we know that the United States is the lead instigator in taking Israel back to the Holocaust. Speaking of this nation, the prophet in the 18th chapter, this is a continuation of the second statement, says, it, speaking of this nation, aggressively conquers and subdues, trampling people down and kicking them out. Wa mebush. It is antagonistic and destructive. It treads others underfoot while imposing its will, often partnering with enemies, subduing those it can control, causing their downfall. It is polluted and rejected, blind and loathsome, seen as educating the world while stripping it bare from bush, desecrating most everything of value, while in the manner of a blind and oblivious child, imposing its will, ruining lives while destroying countries. I'm here to tell you that what we have witnessed in Donald Trump recently, in fact, just bring this to prove the point. What Donald Trump said that Putin was crazy and demeaned Putin, and then wrote in all caps that he was the only person keeping really bad, really bad stuff from happening to Russia. And that if Putin didn't heed his warning that really bad stuff was going to happen to Russia because Putin is now crazy. That is the rhetoric of a spoiled child. That's the rhetoric of a bully and a brat. That's the rhetoric of a nincompoop. I mean, beyond the fact that Putin didn't start this war, the United States did. We going back 17 years, and the proof is overwhelming. I posted it on X. I posted it on Facebook. I've talked about it on these programs. The fact is, the evidence is undeniable and overwhelming that the United States, going all the way back to George Bush, orchestrated this war using Ukraine as a proxy, overthrew their elected government, and provided the weapons to go kill Russians. And then expanded NATO across Europe to the point that Russia was given no choice. We're playing the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again, but this time with absolute immoral idiots on one side. Now, I don't care what you think of Putin. I understand that in America and in Europe, Putin is created and Russia is presented as the boogeyman, because politicians thrive on blaming everybody else but themselves for all of their problems, and Russia has always been the convenient boogeyman. But here's the reality. If you study Putin and you listen to him, he's always prepared. He's always polished. He's always under control. And he is the opposite of crazy. Well, Donald Trump is never prepared. He flip-flops from one position to another one day to the next. He is rude in his rhetoric towards other people. He is domineering. He's as crazy as anyone who has ever been in the White House of the United States. But let's just say that you don't believe me, that you think that I'm politically motivated somehow to say the opposite of what's true because you're a MAGA. And the fact is, I'm apolitical. I'm going to expose and condemn both sides of every political debate when they're wrong. When somebody does something that's right, I will commend them. And I commended Trump on many things as a result of that. Just as I have condemned Biden and cackles on every occasion. Wouldn't you have to be crazy to taunt, to smear, to slander, to threaten the man who has access to the most nuclear weapons by calling him crazy and then threatening him? Wouldn't that make you, by definition, crazy? Donald Trump represents almost everything we have read. When I did this translation 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years ago, every word of it seemed to fit the United States. And I said so. But now it doesn't just fit the United States. Now it is a portrait of the President of the United States. Goes on to say this, to reveal the way and to provide reference which leads to where to find this country, this Eretz, this land and territory. It is divided, baza, cut through by rivers, naharim, streams of flowing water. This is 18.2, still in part. Okay, well, Asher Eretz, baza, naharim, this country which is divided to rivers, is the likely meaning, and of course that would point directly to the United States, which is the country most divided by major waterways of any nation in the world, because it is dissected by more tributaries than any other. The other meaning worth considering is that Asher Eretz Baza Naharim would be to reveal the way, to provide a reference which leads us to where to find this country, because it is seen as contemptible and despised for having traveled so extensively and tread upon others. And no country's citizens on earth travel as broadly, nor any country tread upon the rights of others as much as the United States. We're fighting wars everywhere. And even when we're not fighting a war, we've got our CIA trying to overthrow governments and undermine people everywhere. And even when we're not doing that, we're supplying the weapons to make it possible. So in this one prophetic statement, Yeshaya 18:2, we have been afforded 50 insights into the country comprised of 50 states, which is at the crosshairs of this woe, this warning from God. And these include Ha-Shalak. 1, it dispatches weapons of war, sending out battle groups with an arsenal of implements equipped with missiles for fighting to other places for the purpose of extending its influence. 2, by way of the sea, with the largest navy in the history of the world. Number 3, in the manner of the Gentile nations as a confluence of nationalities. From Seir. 4, the nation dispatches envoys, authorized agents of the government, sent off as part of a delegation with the authority to convey the official message. The U.S. is treating Israel now as its footstool and sending off delegates daily. 5, including sanctioned representatives of false gods to deliver an anguishing religious message. You know how many Americans now in positions of power say, I'm a Christian, therefore I do this, I do that, I do the other thing. Mr. Christ never existed. Number 5, including sanctioned representatives of false gods, so that's the one I've just shared, to deliver an anguishing religious message. Number 6, under the guise of protection, which causes great distress and anxiety because world events will pivot upon the provisions upon which the delegation will insist, and the unintended consequences of almost all American intervention and malfeasance are now legendary. Look what happened with the invasion of Iraq. We gave Iraq to Iran. Screwed up the world beyond salvation. Changed everything because of that stupid move by George Bush, causing the migration of Muslims into Europe that have changed the entire nature of the continent and changed the reach of power of Iran, as a result of which Israel had to tone down, and then America says you can't attack them anymore. We're protecting them. Number 7, because it represents the pivot point or fulcrum upon which events change from bad to worse, ushering in birth pangs, because America is the one that's ultimately going to betray Israel. It's already decided to do so. From Ba Kali Gama 8, in swift floating vessels, which are implements of violence and war, quickly swallowing up great distances with the America's fleets and aircraft carrier battle groups. Number 9, so as to control others, even if it results in collateral damage, thereby destroying and annihilating that which gets in their way. Just look at the United States and Afghanistan and Iraq. We made bad situations worse, and we cost, we spilled the blood of 1 million victims in the process. And you look even the way that America fought the Pacific War and World War II. We avenged the death of 3,000 servicemen with the lives of 300,000 servicemen. Look what we did in bombing Germany and Japan. We were killing 40, 50,000 civilians a night, burning them alive. Now we want to complain that there are some Gazans that are getting hurt by the Israeli bombing. It's got to stop. Yeah, America killed, burning them alive with white sulfur. 50,000 German civilians and Japanese civilians, women and children, a night, month after month. Within which, number 10, absolute authority is imposed such that those inside are essentially captives, imprisoned to fulfill the mission. If you join the U.S. military, you're not a force for freedom. You have surrendered your free will. From Al-Panay Mayem 11, over the surface of the waters because of the appearance and presence of the floodwaters. Floodwaters would be the influx of Muslim mujahideen terrorists. From Malak 12, the representatives who announce their position are empowered to project the influence and authority of those who sent them. From Halak 13, they are escorted and transported from a nation with the freedom of choice, and yet another orders them to do as they have been told. From Call 14, traveling swiftly, indulgently, and inappropriately. 15, while trivializing the complexity of the situation and disregarding the consequences. This is the sign of America. It has been for as long as we can remember. For example, starting the Ukrainian proxy war against Russia, not recognizing that it had no choice, no chance to end in any way that was at all favorable, because even if NATO prevailed and providing enough weapons to pummel Russia, Russia was going to respond with a nuclear holocaust. There was no way to win. It's the same thing with the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. It was lose-lose from the beginning. Everything America touches is that way. Trivializing the complexity of the situation. The tariff war, same exact situation. Not thinking it through, unaware of the unintended consequences. 16, insufficiently concerned about and mostly indifferent to those whose situation they are quick to slight. You can be America's ally today, make all sorts of promises, and the moment that America thinks, I don't want to do that anymore, you are toast. And America will reject you and leave you as if you were diseased. 17, they're impulsive and imprudent, cursing the lives of those they are intending to meddle in. And that's the truth. 18, demonstrating a propensity to hurriedly underestimate the intricacies of existing relationships and thereby rapidly making bad situations worse as they move from one place to another in a short period of time without any regard for their victims, the consequence of their demands, and or the results of their missions. Take sanctions on Russia. The U.S. started the war, then decided they were going to punish Russia by sanctions, put Russia in bed with China, with Iran. And therefore, Iran is able to have the cover to finish their nuclear program. And we have an alliance between China and Russia that is formidable, that the United States cannot oppose without destroying the world. And in the process, we destroy America's position as the reserve currency because of the disruption in trade. Unintended consequences. 19. This nation sends its fleet across the sea, dispatching them hurriedly in response to their own perceptions before thinking the situation through, causing a rapid deterioration, apathetic to the countries they invade, the lives they snuff out, or the disaster they leave behind. Consider Afghanistan, consider Iraq, consider Somalia, consider Libya, consider Syria. And it is therefore 20, depicting the impetus for the invasion of Israel by Islamic terrorists, because impulsively, irrationally, and without concern for the people or nation, America invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, even though not a single Afghani participated in the terrorist attack, and immediately thereafter invaded Iraq, where there wasn't a single al-Qaeda participant, making a bad situation far worse when none of its hasty justifications were valid, leading not only to the destruction of both countries and to the loss of over 1 million lives, but directly to the Syrian war, one that has already ended with the rise of the Islamic State, which the United States created through the Petraeus Awakening program, just as foretold. From El Goy, this is on behalf of a nation, this is point 21, of people from different races and places, a Gentile nation of uncultured and heathen multiculturalists, whose people are a confluence of ethnicities, many of whom have placed their faith in pagan religious beliefs, aka Christianity. From Mashak 22, who are wont to consistently take the lead, directing others, extending their reach and influence. 23, who have a prolonged desire to take things away from others. 24, who are actively involved out in front, enticing and directing others at considerable cost. 25, who have a propensity to engage in the world as if it were their own, habitually seizing whatever they desire. Going to make Greenland a state, going to make Canada a 51st state, going to reclaim the Panama Canal. What's next? Gaza's going to be part of America. 27, continue removing people from their land, initiating and directing the seizure, acquiring great wealth in the process. Yeah, there was an entire nation of indigenous people in North America, all of which the United States invaders either exterminated or turned into essential impoverished slaves. 27, continue removing people from their land. 28, prone to believe in an altered state of reality while overextending and enriching themselves. 29, who are tall on average. 30, exceedingly immodest, and 31, intoxicated with themselves. And from Morat, 32, they are scrubbed clean, well scoured, and overly concerned about personal hygiene. 33, their bodies are smooth-skinned and shaven, so hairless they appear polished, and are typically beardless, and many have shaved heads, as contrasted with Israelites, who are hairy and often bearded. Number 34, yet are typically reckless with weapons, sharpened and gleaming. 35, they rush headlong and are headstrong, participating in perverse actions as a fierce and vehement people who are fond of their military's burnished weapons. Look what we did in Yemen. All we did is pounded Yemen, making a bad situation worse, accomplishing nothing of a worthwhile. Then we claimed victory because we sailed away and allowed the Yemenites and the Houthis to continue to send missiles into Israel because, quite frankly, Trump doesn't give a crap about Israel. From El Amyeri, 36, these people and this nation, along with its army, this citizenry based upon familiar religious and political ties, are frightening and are feared as dreadful, while at the same time respected for their awesome power, because they cause great distress through intimidation, but are also venerated and revered by some for their achievements, capability, and status. 37, especially the awesome sight of their missiles shooting through the air. From the phrase, men hu wa hala'a, 38, from here to there and beyond at a future time, from a considerable distance away and out of a future period, emphatically describing one individual entity from a place and time considerably outside the current reference of the writer, which would have been in Jerusalem. And from the phrase goy ka, 39, this population, which is comprised of many different races, routinely spews out nonsense in a strange foreign language. Number 40, taking down, but never to the degree of the Donald, however. 40, talking down to others. Wow. It's apparent that Yashaya actually witnessed the Donald. My apologies to him. 40, condolences as well. Talking down to others while continually marching off to war based upon a condescending and moronic attitude and rhetoric. 41, acting like a great power, all of which deserve to be mocked and ridiculed because they foolishly judge others, and senseless speeches which parrot the same meaningless phrases, vomiting up their blathering blah, blah, blah. Such that 42, they are always trying to expand and impose their influence, even their faith. 43, establishing the rules while senselessly drawing lines in the sand. 44, while eagerly throwing others out of their land. 45, hoping to bind others together in a common cause as true believers, only to rule over them, building coalitions that they control, dictating to one and each according to a standard that they themselves deem acceptable. 46, all while spewing out the inhabitants that actually deserve the land. And then from Mebush, 47, we discovered that this nation aggressively conquers and subdues, trampling people down and kicking them out. It is antagonistic and destructive, treading others underfoot while imposing its will, often partnering with enemies. Oh boy, wouldn't that be the truth today? Subjugating those it can control, causing their downfall. Subjugating, yes, Israel is now the footstool of America. It is 48, polluted and rejected, blind and loathsome, seen as educating the world while stripping it bare. And finally, from Asher Eretz Baza Naharim, 49, to reveal the way, to provide a reference which leads us to the place we find this country. Its land is divided by rivers. And number 50, it is seen as contemptible and despised for having traveled around the world and treading it down in mass.
How many interconnected coincidences do you have to see?
I think somewhere along the way, you just need to roll over and recognize, okay, you got me. It's the United States. And this was all delivered under a woe for being the nation most responsible for arming Israel's foes, putting Israel in a vulnerable position by never allowing it to defend itself, and then sacrificing the heart of Israel as the next Neville Chamberlain to achieve peace in our time by opening the floodgates of war. Yahweh is not pleased. If you're an American, you ought to be shaking in your sandals. These 50 descriptive pictures of a nation comprised of 50 states must then be combined with the 22 depictions that preceded them, resulting in 72 illustrious portrayals of America circa 2025. No other nation even warrants consideration. While the Roman Catholic Church is religious Babylon, the United States is political Babylon. We know from these words, that this nation on the far side of the world, when viewed from Jerusalem, projects its influence using its fleet so that it should be noted that the United States has the largest navy in the history of the world. The nation deploys 12 massive aircraft carrier battle groups to swiftly project its power far and wide, more than the rest of the world combined, and more are under construction. We should not be surprised by the reference to rapid gunboat diplomacy. No nation has ever deployed a more capable or more fearsome arsenal of oceanic and airborne weapons, often combined into one, than the United States of America. It is perhaps why the nation is both feared and revered, sometimes respected, but oftentimes seen as intimidating. A few years ago, WikiLeaks made the thousands of cables between American ambassadors and the U.S. State Department available, and it revealed cold, arrogant, and immoral attitudes pervasive in the country's envoys. These disclosed, once secret documents revealed that the United States remains oblivious when it comes to the consequence of its actions. For example, very few Americans acknowledge that the country's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were based on a web of lies, and that both military incursions were completely counterproductive and made very bad situations infinitely worse at the loss of thousands of American lives and millions of other innocent lives. And yet, this reality is why so many American troops are committing suicide. States representing 40% of the U.S. population, documenting less than 70% of the military suicides in those states, report 22 per day, revealing that the actual number must be over 80 suicides daily amongst former military. When this is extrapolated over the 15 years since, now 17 years since, America began returning, I should say, from Afghanistan and Iraq, it equates to an astonishing 300,000 American troops taking their own lives as a consequence of what turned out to be foolish, immoral, deadly, and destructive, counterproductive invasions. 300,000. You want to have a Memorial Day celebration? Think on that. The world is filled with Goyim, Gentiles, but one nation and only one nation is known for expressly accommodating racial diversity, America. It's the melting pot. It has grown by beckoning people from around the world. And in this prophecy, Goy, a nation of many races, is singular. Therefore, the warning is to one country, which is why it's not to the European Union. It's America. While many nations have a history of drug and alcohol abuse, the war on drugs has become synonymous with the United States. Its citizens remain the leading consumer of mind-altering narcotics, prescribed recreational and deadly drugs. The U.S. prison population is the largest in the world in aggregate and per capita, with the most inmates being incarcerated for drug-related crimes. America is the leading consumer of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. According to the World Health Organization, overall drug use in the United States is the highest in the world. Recently, the U.S. DEA announced that prescription drug abuse had become the nation's biggest and fastest growing problem and cause of death. It is interesting to note that while Americans are the most intoxicated people on earth due to the prevalence and the quantity of treatment facilities, the nation ranks 29th worst out of 192 nations in overall deaths from illicit drug use. Should you be interested, the leaders of this awful fate include a number of Islamic nations where life isn't worth living, among several of the most devoutly Christian nations on earth as well. Afghanistan, Yemen, Guatemala, Laos, Cambodia, Morocco, Libya, Georgia, Somalia, Iraq, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Tunisia, Lebanon, Tajikistan, Egypt, Serbia, Myanmar, Iran, Sudan, Austria, Syria, Ukraine, Bangladesh, UK, Nigeria, Russia, Bosnia, Ireland, and then the US. Since it was mentioned relative to the height of nations that border on the north of the Baltic seas and are home to the tallest people on average. But after the frosty Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and Germany, with these heavily Baltic peoples averaging 6 feet, the United States boasts the second highest temperate zone population at nearly 5 foot 11 inches, or over an inch taller than the average Israeli. While I could not find a ranking for personal hygiene, I found ample evidence that Americans not only spend more money per capita on cleaning and cosmetic products, but there is also a growing emphasis on being clean-shaven, to the point of spending time and money to remove body hair from most everywhere. A growing number of men have shaved chests and heads. So, considering the propensity of Israelites to be the principal foes of Arab Muslims, and then to be relatively short in stature, overly hairy, typically bearded, and inadequately bathed, Yahowah's description and his terminology seems fitting for this new and different foe as well. Now, I've traveled in nearly 175 countries, and I've gained a perspective on how others view the United States. The first word that comes to mind is arrogant. The second is obnoxious. The third is clueless. For example, Russian President Vladimir Putin took U.S. President Barack Obama to task in an open letter published in the New York Times for promoting the egotistical notion of American exceptionalism, the idea that Americans were and remain superior to all other nations. Yes, there was once a time when the United States was the world's bank, the most prosperous nation on earth, but now, having overextended itself, it is bankrupt. You just don't know it yet, but it is, and you will experience it soon, having squandered its children's future with its national and state debt soaring above, well, between the two, $60 trillion. I wrote this particular narrative a matter of 4 or 5 years ago, and it was 20 trillion at the time. It grew to 50 trillion during the an edit a few years back. 170% of its GDP, and now it is over 60 trillion between state and federal debt. And while Americans are told that the nation is a force for good, that the country's spy network is protecting Americans, and that its military and diplomats have been deployed everywhere to bring peace to the world, the fact is they've brought fire and disaster to everything they've touched. Americans think themselves as the most generous nation, but historically that has not been true. The first colonists took America from the native peoples, brutalizing them in the process. And when the Indians resisted to manifest destiny and said that that's not right, America stole Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California from Mexico by waging a war against them. The Republic of the Philippines was obtained the same way, by war, this time in a war against the Spanish. And now the United States wants to take God's land away from his people, as well as take Canada, Greenland, Panama, and who else will come to mind for the Trumpster next week or the week after. He's now today came out and said, you know, I'm going to offer a deal to Canada. I'll give them the Golden Dome for cheap if they agree to become the 51st state. The Golden Dome, the Trump Dome, is never going to be put into service. I mean, never. And why would a Republican, if if he has any sanity, if he thought through things before he put his foot in his mouth. He is a Republican, correct? Yeah, I thought so. Okay. And you recall the last elections in Canada? The Conservative Party, which would be left of Republicans or Democrats in America, got trounced. In fact, the guy who ran for prime minister lost his own district race to the parliament. And it was an annihilation. It wasn't even close. If Canada became the 51st state, there would never be a Republican elected to national office again. I mean, it's the man never thinks. Okay. He was also offered the 51st state to Greenland. I think there's only like 60,000 people in all of Greenland. You're going to make 60,000 people a state? Huh? Yeah, you've got what, 7 or 8 states already in Canada. You're going to make them 50 share. We only got one more. We got one more star for that flag. I'm sorry about that. We're going to have to share. Well, but Gaza is going to be the first because Gaza was going to be part of America too. Resorts. America's military is the most massive in human existence. It is larger than most every other military on Earth combined. If you combine the nation's spy apparatus and its military, we outspend the rest of the world combined. And of course, the largest export of America is military hardware. And so now we are the merchants of death. The nation has wasted $30 trillion on its war machine over the past 50 years, leaving Americans less free and more vulnerable in the process. You know, they said, you owe your freedom to a veteran. No, I don't. There hasn't been a single American soldier who has ever fought to protect America. I've gone off to fight wars in other places, but the closest war that could be attributed to American troops defending Americans would be the War of 1812, when the British tried to retake the colony. You can't even include the Revolutionary War for 2 reasons. One is there was no American military in the Revolutionary War. There were militias. And number 2, 2/3 of Americans wanted to stay under the control of England at the time and didn't want their independence. So it was not a popular uprising. And in the War of 1812, even though the battle was to retain America's independence from Great Britain, you can't count that either, because the only time that a actual military unit of the United States fought, they got their butts kicked, and the war was won by militias, average citizens that fought on behalf of the United States. The fact of the matter is, the United States is cannot be invaded and occupied so long as the Second Amendment stays in effect. You do not need a military, which is why Thomas Jefferson insisted on the Second Amendment and was so opposed to the establishment of a military. And oh, by the way, of that $50 trillion that has been wasted on the U.S. war machine, having accomplished nothing of any value and making a whole lot of bad situations worse, at the last audit of the U.S. military, there was $2 trillion unaccounted for. You know, Doge, you know, was all excited about the waste that they found in USAID. USAID, if you count all of the waste of USAID over its entire inception, it doesn't amount to a month of the U.S. military. Just saying. And after fighting 101 wars since the Europeans first arrived in the New World, one every 4 years, the warmongering nation wants to take on God, forcing his chosen people out of their homes. But Yahweh is not amused, which is why America has been warned in Yeshaya, Isaiah 18. Historically and prophetically, Yahweh only comments on nations that interact with Israel, especially those that aid and abet the nation's demise. It all goes back to the promise Yahweh made to Abraham, where those who support Israel and the covenant would be blessed, and those in opposition would be cursed. From God's perspective, the United States of America has become the people's most destructive adversary because they relied on America, and America betrayed them. From this viewpoint, do not lose sight of the fact that in addition to the United States instigating the wars that are currently engulfing the Islamic world, especially the proxy war that was just recently waged by terrorists in Syria, the ongoing mess throughout the Islamic world. Look at the Islamic gangs that are vying for control over Libya after we ousted Muammar Gaddafi. Look at the fact that we gave Iraq to Iran by invading Iraq. Look at what we've done to empower the Taliban now all over Afghanistan as a result of that failure. The mess that we left in Somalia. No matter where you turn, it's just a disaster. And you look at Pakistan, which the United States makes it possible for the Muslims to impose their draconian rule there by supplying all the weapons. The United States supplies the preponderance of weapons that are being wielded now against Israel. And the reason that happened is if you go back to the wars that Israel originally fought, their adversaries were wielding mostly Russian weapons. And the United States stopped all of that. The reason the United States kept Israel from winning those wars and keeping the land that they had confiscated as a result of winning those wars is what America wanted is for Egypt and for Syria and for Jordan and for Saudi Arabia and all of these Islamic nations that had combined to fight Israel. It wanted them to all stop buying Russian weapons and to start buying American weapons. And the only holdout was Syria, which is why the United States allowed the Islamic State to bludgeon the Assad regime because the Assad regime was the last holdout. It's all about buying U.S. weapons. That is our policy. It is an unpopular truth, but the fact remains that almost everything the United States has done in the past 50 years, militarily, politically, and economically, has been ill-conceived and counterproductive, all leading up to the two biggest blunders in the nation's history. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, which led to the absolute transformation of the Islamic Middle East, such that it became this powder keg poised for world war via the machinations that are now occurring in Syria. And the U.S. military once again trampled people underfoot in an ill-fated attempt to impose the nation's will. And while these suicidal misappropriations of force made the U.S. more vulnerable, the realization is that it will lead to America sacrificing Israel to the Muslims, throwing the rightful inhabitants of the land under the bus, which is engendering Yahowah's anger. And it will turn out to be irrevocable, instigating World War III. This politically, economically, and military-inspired capitulation to evil is going to be fatal. Instrumental to this mistake in judgment is the nation's nonsensical rhetoric. The public discourse has become a stream of amoral misconceptions, unfounded opinions, and outright lies. Boy, when you canvass the popular spokesmen and women on X, and you listen to their anti-Semitic rhetoric and the insanity of the things that they are saying politically and religiously and economically, you realize that we now have as the world's news source an entity that is aiding and abetting the demise of humanity in X, rewarding insanity. While the mainstream media has always been more prone to error than truth, it doesn't even hold a candle to the amount of rage and poisonous, irrational, ill-informed, immoral rhetoric that one finds on X. The final depiction, that of a land divided by rivers, also fits America, as I have said. If it were river singular, the U.S. would have competition from Africa and South America with the Nile and the Amazon, but not when the term is plural. Nothing distinguishes North America geographically from other continents more than its many voluminous and long rivers that divide the land. They include the Mississippi, the Missouri, Ohio, Arkansas, Colorado, Columbia, Rio Grande, Tennessee, Brazos, Yellowstone, St. Lawrence, Hudson, James, Shenandoah, Potomac, Rappahannock, Susquehanna, Snake, Kern, and Yukon, just to name a few. In summary, we know that the United States is a melting pot of peoples and thus is quintessentially Gentile. More than any other nation, it likes to meddle in other people's affairs. Americans think that it is their obligation to the world to be their God and to set the rules, which is why its military is used to impose democracy on others. Americans talk a lot, all too often projecting an altered state of reality, which is why political and religious talk radio, along with the blogs, are so influential in this culture. And patriotically, the U.S. marches off to wars, 101 of them, leaving its military to tread underfoot those that it has sought to influence, always leaving a bad situation worse. Even in Europe in World War II, the way that America waged that war, it left Europe worse off than we found it. Yeah, Adolf Hitler was one really bad dude, but Stalin was worse. And we fought that war in a way that half of Europe was left under the control of communists. Before we press on, let's consider where we have been. The 18th chapter of Yeshayah commences with this profoundly important prophecy. And I'm going to go through this one last time. I know I'm pushing well beyond the hour that we typically try to limit this show, but I would like to stay on this while we're focused. And it begins, woe, this warning, expressing dissatisfaction and a warning of impending doom to the land of whirling wings and of hovering airplanes, of loud percussive flying weapons with vibrating and noisy metal components swirling around, which devour and destroy, and of rhythmic clamor, of armaments which fly and attack, coming well beyond where the land ends, from a distant place at the far ends of the earth, often stealthy, which relationally speaking is from the region situated across and on the opposite side of the world. It is an arrogant and haughty place, prone to furious outbursts, born out of an improper attitude and bias, a meddling busybody with a propensity to involve others in its affairs. It is located in the direction of the rivers of Cush, thus in association with Babylon. It dispatches its weapons of war, sending out battle groups with an arsenal of missiles for the purpose of extending its influence by way of the sea in a manner of Gentile nations, along with envoys, including authorized representatives of false gods. It is prone to deliver an anguishing religious message under the guise of protection, which causes a great distress among other nations, because world events will pivot in a detrimental and painful manner based upon the provisions which this delegation will insist, starting the birth pangs. And so in swift floating vessels, quickly swallowing up great distance, among warships equipped to rapidly accomplish their undertaking, which is to control others, even if there is collateral damage, and that is a direct consequence within the ships where absolute authority is imposed, such that those inside are essentially captives, imprisoned to fulfill the mission over the surface of the waters because of the presence of these floodwaters. The messengers who are empowered to project their influence and authority travel swiftly, indulgently, and inappropriately, trivializing the complexity of the situation while disregarding the consequences, unfairly indifferent to those whose situation they are quick to slight, impulsively and imprudently cursing the lives of those they are intending to meddle in, demonstrating a propensity to hurriedly underestimate the intricacies of existing relationships, and thereby rapidly making a bad situation worse as they move from one place to another in a short period of time without sufficient regard for their victims or for the end result of their missions. This on behalf of a nation of people from different races and places who are wont to consistently take the lead, directing others, extending their reach and influence, who are actively involved out in front, enticing, directing others at considerable cost, who have a propensity to engage in the world as if it were their own, habitually seizing whatever they desire. This nation seeks to control coinage and thus the means to commerce and to trade, acquiring and holding vast sums of money, continually removing people from their land and acquiring great wealth in the process. They are prone to believe in an altered state of reality while overextending and enriching themselves. They are also typically tall, immodest, and frequently intoxicated. They are scrubbed clean, smooth-skinned, and shaven, and yet reckless with weapons, sharpened and gleaming, over-concerned about personal hygiene. Their bodies are so hairless, they often appear polished. Most are beardless, and many have shaven heads as they rush headlong and headstrong, participating in perverse actions. They are fierce and venomous, people who are fond of their military's burnished weapons. These people are frightening and feared, even dreadful, while at the same time respected for their awesome power, causing great distress through intimidation via shock and awe. But they are also venerated and revered by some for their achievements, their capabilities and status, especially the awesome sight of their missiles shooting through the air from here to there and beyond in a future time. This population, which is comprised of many different races and places, routinely spews out nonsense in a foreign language, talking down to others while continually marching off to war based upon their condescending and moronic rhetoric. They act like a great power, all of which deserves to be mocked and ridiculed. They routinely parrot the same meaningless phrases, vomiting up their blathering blah, 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 and thus they must be disparaged and derided. They are always trying to expand and impose their nation's influence, even the nation's faith, establishing the rules while senselessly drawing lines in the sand. And yet they imprudently throw others out of their land. It aggressively conquers and subdues, trampling people down by kicking them out. It is antagonistic and destructive, treading others underfoot while imposing its will, often partnering with enemies. It will subjugate those it can control, causing their downfall too. It is polluted and rejected, blind and loathsome, seen as educating the world while stripping it bare. This is a desecrated place of blind and oblivious children, imposing their will, ruining their lives while destroying countries. To reveal the way and to provide a reference which leads to where to find this country, it is divided by rivers, which also are indicative of a large population of people who travel extensively. Yashaya Isaiah 18:2. Goodbye, America. The not so great, after all. I thank you for listening to the conclusion of this, the gateway to a return to the Holocaust, as a consequence of what we're witnessing now, millions of Jews are going to die, and the casualties among the Goyim will be in the billions. Thank you for listening.